Welcome, everybody. My name is Steven Feuerstein. I'm one of the developer advocates at Oracle Corporation for Oracle Database and all of our technologies, and I lead a team of other developer advocates, Connor McDonald, Chris Saxon, Blaine Carter, and Dan McGann. And our jobs are to help you get more out of Oracle Database. And one of the things we do is offer the Office Hours programs based in Oracle AskTOM website, in which developers, product managers, and even experts from the community take time out of their busy days to share their expertise with you and take your questions. And today, I have one of those office hour sessions in which I'm going to do mostly listening, and we're going to see and learn from other experts. And the topic for today is tips for writing PL SQL in Apex applications. So my focus is on PL SQL, and one of the ways that PL SQL is being used a lot these days and in a very exciting way is within Apex applications, Oracle Application Express. So we're going to explore that. As you can see on this page, I have a bit.ly to go to the PL SQL Office Hours page whenever you're interested in finding out about what's coming up in this program. So PL SQL Office Hours, part of Oracle AskTOM. You can always come to this URL and learn about the latest one. You can also check out our previous sessions, of which there are many, recordings for all of them. Dive in, learn more and more about PL SQL. You can submit questions, which come to me and to Chris Saxon, and we might answer them or pass them along to somebody else who can answer them. You can also give us feedback on the session after you sign in. So we do encourage you to sign into the site. You don't have to use Office Hours. And also subscribe to this session so that you get email reminders. How cool is that? So the way this program will work for today, like most of our others, is that we'll take questions and comments over chat. And you should be able to see the chat button on the bottom of your Zoom screen and dive in. And I'll be watching the chat screen as our presenters present on their topics. So let's cruise along. Quick advertisement. In case you don't know about it, you have access to an always free Oracle Cloud account now. It includes Oracle Database and a number of other utilities, including Apex, including SQL Developer Web, that will help you build applications entirely for free, or you can use this as a jumping point into full production application development on the Oracle Cloud. So I'm going to say a couple of words about the general context that we're going to be looking at around Apex and PL SQL, and then our experts will dive on in. So here's the bottom line. Oracle Application Express gives you this incredible low-code environment, essentially a UI in which you can point and have it generate code, including PL SQL, including SQL, including JavaScript, HTML, and it presents a web application or mobile application to you, which is so wonderful. It's actually breathed new life into PL SQL, I think, in a way that nobody would have predicted several years ago, or at least 10 years ago now. And we love to work in that declarative mode of just clicking on things and having it create a UI for us. Fantastic, very productive. Okay, the problem is that we don't yet, and probably will never be able to offer you a completely declarative way of building complex applications that meet every single user requirement. You can get a lot done by default with point and click in Apex, usually not 100%. And then what do? You write SQL and you write PL SQL, and if maybe you're super duper unlucky or super duper talented, you might even write JavaScript. I stick to the PL SQL side. So you move away out of the declarative interface and you start writing code, and that's where the trouble can really begin. And in fact, over time, I think anybody who's worked in Apex for a while or any kind of low-coding environment will come to realize that that code that's hidden behind those beautiful pages and declarative interfaces will often become the biggest challenge you'll face in terms of debugging your code, maintaining your code, enhancing it over time. The bottom line is that unless you're really, really careful, your code ends up looking like this, a Rube Goldberg machine of all these different parts and pieces flying around in ways you can barely even imagine, much less understand. And that what you end up looking forward to is moving on to the next project instead of making this the most wonderful experience for you and your customers. So the question is, how do we avoid situations like this? Now, I have to admit, I have a presentation on writing PL SQL tips in Apex, and I could have done my presentation, but I really like to learn from other people. I'm sure you do too, which is why you're here. So what I thought I would do is invite several experts who have been doing Apex for years and have a lot of experience in these various aspects to share their experiences with you. So what I'm going to do is learn and ask questions and watch, obviously, on the chat line for your questions as well. So we have 3 speakers today, Cannell, Scott Wesley, and Scott Spendolini. If you're active in the Apex community, you've probably know these folks, you've learned from them already, and hopefully you're eager. Leave it to them to each introduce themselves a bit and talk about what they've been doing with Apex, and then take time in the sunlight for their 15 minutes of fame and share their experiences. So, Karen, I'd like to turn it over to you first.
All right. Hi, I'm Karen Cannell. I'm president of TH Technology, which means I get to write Apex and PL SQL code for my clients all the time. That's what I do. I've been working with Oracle and HTMLDB since it first came out.
Wow.
Back with Anton Nielsen, way back early 90s. And I've been fortunate to have clients who love Apex and do projects on Apex and PL SQL and Oracle databases since then. Too many years to put on a resume. What I wanted to share with you is the basics. Thank you, Steven, for the intro. That's perfect. I always tell people go back to basics before you get the spaghetti machine or the bicycle tire machine. When Steven first asked about this, my first reaction was don't. He said writing PL SQL and Apex. Don't unless you have to. So what that means is don't reinvent the wheel. When you dynamically generate a page or use one of the wizards and generate a form or generate a grid or a data load process, Apex gives you apply MRU. It gives you processes. I'm forgetting the exact name in the newer versions. It gives you processes that does the insert, update, delete. If at all possible, don't reinvent those processes. Use the Apex processes because they are tailored to do and integrate with everything else that Apex does behind the scenes. So what does that translate to? Do it declaratively first. And then if what is generated declaratively is not enough for you, that's when you jump in and supplement what's done declaratively to do the rest of your business logic. Maybe you have auditing requirements. Maybe you have additional saves that have to happen. And I think some people, and I've seen this, first thing they do is they don't even just disable, they delete the Apex generated processes and write their own. Don't do that unless you're ready to handle all that going forward. So only write your PL SQL processes to supplement what the Apex processing is. Now, given that I said don't do that, I know there are people out there that do that, and there are valid reasons that you may have to do that. Hopefully, you'll be supplementing and not replacing the Apex processes. So when you do, be ready to take on responsibility for maintaining that new process when you upgrade to the next point version, the next major version. Be thorough and make sure, especially if you're replacing a process, be thorough, make sure it really does, your process really does everything that the Apex process does. Use the Apex APIs that will help you when you upgrade. If you don't, you're kind of out in the desert really, really on your own. And I shouldn't have to say this, but document what you did and why you circumvented the default stuff. Because the next person coming along a year later or 6 months later, which is probably going to be you, will want to remember why you did that weird thing and circumvented the Apex processes.
Karen, that is such a great point, not just about Apex, but anytime you're writing something in which you're thinking to yourself, oh, this is so cool, I got this to work and it was not really clear. That means that nobody is going to understand what you did, including yourself, in a little while to come. So that's where you really want to put a comment. Thanks.
Okay. All right. And I know we all have examples of that. And when would you reinvent the wheel? Different auditing needs, when you really have complex business requirements, mainly it's to supplement the Apex processes. My example is I had to write a data load wizard. And if anyone's built a data load wizard for people to upload data, it gives you this transform option, and you can write functions on that operates on all these rows, but it doesn't log anything. And our requirement was to log every change we made to incoming data. So I had to literally pull data out of the collections and do a bunch of stuff and dump things back into the collections. Every single point release, that data upload wizard changed. Something in the collections changed, something in their processes changed. And now they've come out with the new data parsing APIs. So the next time this group upgrades, I get to rewrite that whole thing. Now, so how do you explain to your client this stuff that we've been nurturing along for since Apex 4.2, I think? The good news is, it's really improved, and we have this data parser wizard, and it's going to be easier. The bad news is I have to rewrite the whole thing so it'll work.
Yep.
Yeah, just be prepared for that when you go outside of the sandbox. So my next big point, don't litter. Put your code in packages, procedures, and functions so that not every line of code is stuffed in an Apex process. People have been doing this littering since way back in Oracle Forms. And when they came to upgrade their Oracle Forms to Apex or another platform, first thing they had to do was go collect all the business logic and figure out what it is and put it in packages and procedures and functions so we could easily include that in Apex. So again, don't leave little snippets of code. And I know it's really, if you're going along in your this is rapid development, and I just need this little piece of code here, and it's only like 10 lines, and now it's 20, and now it's 30, and I'll just add that in. And now I really should add the error capture. And when you get there, take that chunk of code, put it in a procedure or function, hopefully in a package, and now it's reusable, and now you can debug it in one place, and now you can actually clean out the stuff that's in your Apex process, which makes that page cleaner and easier to read. And also, if you name that procedure or function something that makes sense, that gives you a clue as to what it actually does, that's really helpful too. Again, not just for yourself, but for the next person. So this is all the stuff I just said. As you're doing that, putting your code into procedures or functions, you don't want to use, you need to use parameters instead of the direct references to your items. Again, that makes it easier for the next person to come along. It makes it reusable. It's sanity.
It also makes it easier to test, so you can test your code outside of Apex with the fewer moving parts. So you want to make sure your query returns the right data, your procedures and functions do the right thing outside of Apex, so when you put them into Apex and something goes wrong, it's in the Apex side, not in the PL SQL or backend code side.
Exactly, Steven. Which brings me to my third point. Don't do it the hard way. It's so much easier to develop, debug, and tune things outside of Apex, meaning in SQL Developer, in Visual Studio Code, in PL SQL Developer, whatever IDE you use, build, develop, tune your stuff there. So much faster than building it in Apex. Then it works. When you move it into Apex, now you've got, is it a value problem or is it a code problem? Well, I know my code works outside of Apex, so I probably got a value problem. And then you can use the Apex debugger, find out what you're catching, what's coming in, what's coming out. So much easier if things are modularized and developed outside of Apex. Again, parameterize. Use an error processing module. I don't care if you use Logger or you're homegrown or whatever. So much better to capture those errors and log them somehow, because if your users are like mine, they say, it broke. It broke.
Right, help, something went wrong, fix it.
Yeah. So if you've got your code instrumented and you're logging errors behind the scenes, that makes it easier for you as a developer to figure out really what went on. The other thing that developers do is say, I was doing this and this happened. And if I have a log of things along the way, I can find out they weren't really doing that. They were doing something else. that happened, and that's really helpful as well. It's again, it's sanity. It's a little more coding. It takes a little bit longer, but it saves you sanity in the long run. So those are my big three. Don't do it unless you have to. Don't put all kinds of litter code in Apex, and don't do all your coding outside of Apex. Don't do it the hard way. And I have to go back to point 0. We're seeing, don't forget where you live. We're in an Oracle database. Back to relational modeling 101, relational data modeling. I love it when Joel demonstrates the drag and drop the spreadsheet, and we have an app, and it works wonderful, and it's perfectly tuned and all that. Well, it isn't. And if your end user spreadsheets are like mine, they've got 250 columns, and they're gonna drag that up and make it an app, and I'm like, no, don't do that. At least warn people. You should have a relational model behind the scenes. And we as developers, it's our job to make sure that happens. If you and there's lots of ways to do this. I believe data modeling is still a core skill for people who are doing Oracle web development, whether it's in Apex or other things, or even when you're building REST data services, because that's how we tune. If we have a sound data model behind the scenes and the right indexes, our code is going to run faster. So if you're not a super data modeler, use Quick SQL. That's actually built into Apex now. It's a nice, easy way to get a decent data model up there, and maybe you have to tweak it after that, but it gets you most of the way there. If you're in an organization where you need the full-blown data model with all the different layers of relational and logical models, use SQL Developer Data Modeler. And remember that without a data model, and even with a data model, performance issues in Apex are magnified. So if it's a little bit slow in your IDE or the SQL prompt, it's magnified slow in Apex. So you really want to be careful of that. And one last point, don't wing it. Have standards and use your standards throughout. That makes it easier for anyone else coming after you. It actually makes it faster to code and debug because you know what's going on. And if you actually use your standards, then your apps kind of operate the same. And when something happens, you go, oh, it must be that, because that's our API for doing inserts into table X. So that is it from me.
All right. Thank you so much, Karen. Fantastic.
Cool.
So
we're good.
All right. Can you hear me all okay?
Can hear you. Yep. Can't see you.
Oh, I better share my video. There we go. Hi everyone. Oh, there you are. I'm also looking at a different monitor, so sorry if I'm not always looking at that little thing over there. My name is Scott Wesley. I'm from Australia. It's currently night time and it's still pretty darn warm. So I've got the fan on, but apparently you can't hear it, so that's all good. I've been working with Apex for a long time now. I used to work with Oracle Forms, and I far more enjoy the Apex environment. So a few things I've got. I decided to build a little Apex application to demonstrate what I have to talk about today, because why not? We're talking about PL SQL and Apex. And I didn't really want to go back to PowerPoint straight away. So I do have this available for download and looking around. It is on the apex.oracle.com website. So that 109671 app ID will get you to exactly what we're looking at right now. And I've also published it on my GitHub site here. So if you want to download it, it can be done from there too.
And just so you know, folks, on the PL SQL Office Hours page, where you'll be able to watch a recording of this in the future, there'll also be a link to the app at the bottom of the page, where you click on resources, and then you'll see it listed there. Thanks.
I believe this is the page that Steven is talking about. All right, so the first page I've got here is actually a crossover with SQL as well, not just PL SQL. And I've got two examples down the line here. A nice, good example with a very simple SQL statement that's not doing much at all, compared to a not as good example, where I'm doing a lot more work to do the same duties. And I'm embedding a lot of code in my SQL. I'm not abstracting this information out of the SQL statement and using the declarative features we have available to us. So, for example, the bolding here, if I go to page 10 in my application, I've just gone to my column, my employee name column, and I've used this class here, which is a content modifier that's published that we can all use and integrate into applications. In this case, I use it to make the contents of this column bold. And at the bottom of each page, I've got a few links that refer to what it is I'm talking about here. So there's a link here to go to the content modifiers page, and this is the universal theme that's published by the Apex team. And there's our content modifiers, such as where our text appears in our reports, what case it appears in, and what style it has. There's our U-bold that I've used. So that can be done instead of calling PL SQL within your SQL. The extra context switching is what Oracle doesn't need. Or embedding your HTML code in here, instead of embedding this under every row and generating more content that I need to also switch over and say, do not escape these special characters. I could just say, well, here's an extra column that I won't display. Based on my business condition, I wanted to have some special treatment. What does that special treatment mean? Well, at the top of my page, I've got a class here that's special. I've put my CSS in a CSS class as opposed to integrating it in MySQL, and out it comes as purple. So we're getting our logic out of the code that doesn't need to be there.
And it seems specifically what you're saying is any of the UI stuff, you don't want to have it sitting in your SQL, or you have a UI environment for that. So use that UI environment, keep your SQL clean.
So we've got a great separation of duties in between what our SQL is finding for us to what we want to display on the page and how we want it to look. And it quickly gets into a world of trouble when you've got to repeat those conditions, or you've just got to embed a lot of code in there. It's just leading you down the wrong path. So hopping on to the next topic here.
Good morning. Sorry, I'm in the webinar.
Oh, we've got someone unmuted. The next topic I've got here is conditions. The reference here, people are asking the wrong questions. I found when I first started using Apex, I was comfortable in using this type of condition here. So what I mean by that is often on page 20 here, I could go to one of these regions that I've got on my page, and I see a server-side condition that says PL SQL expression. I know what a PL SQL expression is. There's a few syntaxes that I'm not familiar with as a new person to Apex, so I thought, well, this is the syntax I'm good with. It's a bind variable, I'm comparing it to something, and I'm away. It's doing what I need it to do. But what I found, and this may be a problem of an earlier version of Apex that has since been refactored, but I found this slowed down the page, only a little bit, but when you have 50 of these, that little bit adds up to an awful lot. And that's my general mantra with coding in general. If you do those little 1%ers, those little things that help performance along the way, then they'll all add up to not much. So in this case, I found that, well, this could be a declarative condition. I could say, well, I want that to be just a item. This is equal to this value here. And Apex would build this when it renders the page in a more efficient manner. And I tried to test this again because it's something that I found true a number of years ago, and maybe things have changed. So as all good scientists do, they try and repeat their tests. And when I did, I got to the bottom here, and I basically ran this page, which is full of a whole bunch of regions with conditions on them of various types. So there's one here with a condition that's a SQL statement. Do any rows exist from this query that just selects some random query? And at the end of the day, it was kind of as expected. The interpreted code did take a little bit longer to execute than the declarative conditions that were down at the bottom of the list, but the difference was minor. It was certainly in the order I expected, but I expected a bit of bigger range of results. But that's good to see that it takes a lot of iterations to really make a dent in what is sometimes a fair bit of work here. So I would put that question out to other people. Do they find conditions slow down their pages, or are they happy with how it all works for them? So something that we can look at in the chat when you have room. But I'll move on to my next topic on the list here, 12C triggers. Quite some time ago, Sven posted a post called The Perfect Trigger, which there is no trigger, there is no spoon. So a good example I have here is if I could type some information in, I want to add that, and that just does an insert into my table. And I've defined this table using these identity columns, which is essentially defining a sequence in the table, in the database, and using that sequence as a default value, something that we waited years and versions for, and finally came along in 12C, and I've been embracing it since, and I've been finding it very useful. There's less things I need to declare and worry about. I don't need to worry about a trigger half the time. And when it comes to inserting, I don't need to worry about the ID at all. And when we transfer data between environments and we need to reset that sequence, there is defined syntax there already for us to do that. So I can alter this table, modify the ID, start with limit value, and it basically does a select max from the table and says, well, it needs to be that plus 1. And my new environment is fine. Compared to code that we've seen in the past and may still exist because it's around, and may still get freshly created as well, where I've created a table and I've created a trigger associated with that table, and I said, well, if you're inserting a new row, then I'll just grab that sequence from Joule, because before 11G we had to. But in this case, I'm also using an NVL to say, well, if they've supplied the ID, then I'll use that. But as some SQL aficionados may recall, this NVL will do that regardless. So every single time I go to add a new note, it starts at 101 here. I'll add another record, and it's jumped to the SQL cache.
Mm-hmm.
But here we go. We're now starting to jump in steps of 2, because every time I run this code here, it's also doing that next val. It's just doing all this unnecessary work and all this extra code that we don't need to write. Sometimes people just sort of write it like that. They assign their sequence value so they can also have it as well. We could do that over here with a returning clause, which I've been meaning to add into this example. So less code, more efficient, and I find it more satisfactory. On to another performance issue with interpreted SQL. Apex is full of interpreted SQL. It's the very nature of how it needs to work. And Oracle Forms was the same way. We limited the amount of code that we had in our Oracle Forms triggers because they had to do a round trip to the database, run that code, and give us the results. Here, well, Apex is in the database, so that's not really an issue anymore, but it still needs to interpret code. And it's most particularly relevant with plugins. If you integrate some plugins in your Apex application, often they'll come with the code embedded in the PL SQL attribute, which is expected. That's all nicely knit and integrated, but that does extra work. And I tried this out again the other day to repeat an exercise I did some time ago, but I used a different method of gathering these statistics. Used the Oracle's own instrumentation to see how many reads and buffer gets and whatnot the API call was doing. So if I had my PL SQL code compiled as a package versus having the PL SQL code interpreted when it's required. And the amount of work that the API needs to do seems to be minimal. It can do a lot of work without needing to do a lot of physical reads, if any at all. And it gets a lot of that done in a short amount of time compared to passing this dynamically. And I wasn't even executing that code. It was just sitting there in the API definition, not being used. And every time it ran the page, it interpreted it and slowed the page down, and it's noticeable. My most recent blog post, I blogged about this, gave some figures at the end. It was running about twice the performance, but the extra work that it does need to do to resolve whatever it needs to resolve was really noticeable with these buffer gets. So I'll defer that to experts as to why that's particularly bad, but it's measurably noticeable. And this goes for not just plugin code, but all your code. Any code that you have, as Karen mentioned, if you're compiling your API calls in packages and calling those packages in your code like this, so you send your value as a binary variable to your code that you can test independently, and compared to having all your code just sitting within the Apex application itself, being interpreted on the fly, not being reusable necessarily. And the same goes with your SQL. Define them as views instead of embedding a lot of code that needs to be interpreted on the fly. So I'm going right for time here. And the other thing I was going to mention here, actually no, I'll leave it to the open question.
Good idea. Yes, we do need to let the other Scott have his moment in the sun as well.
Yes, I am noticing time here. And so I won't go into too much detail with the dodging exceptions here, but here's another discussion point that I like to open to the community, is how they code their exception handlers in Apex. For dynamic actions, I think it's clear that you need to have an exception handler, because if you don't have one, the message isn't very nice for the user. But if you do have one, we can display something nice to the user, or display something appropriate. But the real question comes when you're submitting the entire page. And I find that having no handler and letting the Apex environment handle that exception is the easiest, the least amount of code, and gives you the most accurate error stack compared to either re-raising your exception or trying to handle it yourself. You'll get unexpected outcomes. So this page will demonstrate a bit of that if you want to have a play. And my final page here.
I'm sorry, Scott, can you go back for just a second?
Yes, sure.
I didn't mean to say you need to skip everything and stop right away. Click on the DA catch again, or the page one. That's right.
Any particular one, sorry?
The last one you ran that showed the yellow box with a little I next to it. I think it was the process.
Yes. So when it comes to submitting the entire page, we can click process none, and that will.
Wait, that's okay. So what I wanted to point out, you were saying this is better, and of course that doesn't look better right there, but I just wanted to make sure people notice the box below that one, in which you have access to an API that you can control the messages displayed and stack them. So,
fair enough. So
you want to get. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. There's a few layers in between that, because in your application, you can define a application error handler. So in the application attributes, did I click that? There is a place where you can handle those errors. You can sanitize them, because if you don't want them to look like that and you want to disappear the error number, for example, you can transform these errors as they come through and handle them all in the one place. And as Stephen was mentioning, we could also use the API, the supplied API. So if we want to use that instead, when I press that button and run this bit of code here, I get a much nicer error. I translate that to something that the user might want to have without the error code, and it still behaves like a exception that has been handled.
Excellent, thanks.
Compared to re-raising it, which can add to your stack and not be as nice. All right, so my final page here, I listed a few supplied APIs that I use regularly, or I used when I first started using Apex. And the SQL Workshop itself can help you build your own packages, your own table APIs that you need, so you don't need to write a line of code. All my examples here were about minimizing the amount of code that we need to write, because we're in a low-code environment. SQL Workshop does it all for us. We've got an Apex collection package here that has everything that we need to manipulate what is essentially a global temporary table in Apex. We can use Apex item to generate items on the fly in a tabular report. We can use the data parser package from 19.1 to interpret CSV and Excel files. My favorite here at the moment is using Apex string to manipulate strings to and from tabular format to a delimited format, and so on, including community supplied APIs. I used to use my custom built login routine, but this had all the edges polished for me, or most of them. And there's other libraries out there that are full of things here ready for people to utilize right now, so you don't need to write the code. People are a little bit hesitant about using other people's plugins, but are you going to write that code yourself? Otherwise, you could embrace this. When you version upgrade, maybe you should be responsible for that code. It could be argued that the author is, but that's where the selection of the correct plugins or plugins that you're confident will last comes in. So my open question as I hand over to Scott Spendolini for the chat room is, when would you use this function?
The V function. All right, so consider that and put your comments in the chat. We'll turn it over to Scott Spendolini. Thanks so much, Scott Wesley. And take it away, Scott.
All righty. Share my screen. Everybody should be able to see something, I hope.
Yep, and who are you?
Okay, so good question. I'm the other Scott Spendolini, Vice President of the Apex practice at a company here in the States called Viscosity, based out of Texas. I know it's really hot in Australia, but I think we're going to get up into the 70s Fahrenheit today. So kind of weird putting up the Christmas tree and having the windows open, and it just doesn't feel like the holiday season quite yet. I'm not quite used to that. Meanwhile, it's snowing pretty hard up in New England. I don't miss it. I really don't. Anyway, so I've been using Apex. I was one of the actual first product managers of Apex back in 2003 or so. Left Oracle in 2005 and have been through a number of different organizations, all of which I've focused 100% on Apex. So I've been using it for quite some time. And as I was going through and listening to Karen and the other Scott present here, a couple comments before I jump into my little spiel about security with PL SQL. Can't emphasize how critical the data model is enough. I know Karen mentioned it, and the discussion in the chat has kind of gone back and forth between quick SQL and SQL data modeler. That's critical. You've got to spend time. You've got to get used to using those tools. You're going to find issues. You're going to fix stuff. You're going to find all your deficiencies earlier rather than later. It doesn't solve it, right? It's not to say if you use a data model tool, you'll be perfect every time, but you will solve problems that are going to get a lot nastier later, much sooner if you spend that time doing data modeling. It really bothers me that if you look on Twitter and you go to some of the hipper, cooler conferences or Reddits or wherever, no one's talking about this. Everyone's talking about the latest and the greatest, JavaScript this, or big data, or NoSQL, or some SQL, or medium SQL. That's a foundational piece that just can't be overstated. Logger too, I love Logger. Logger has some Apex specific hooks to it, of course, which makes it even nicer. One of the things though, when building any application, Apex or otherwise, make sure you provide some sort of notification, not just to the user, but to the developer. Users don't care for the most part. They'll go through, they'll see an error. Either they complain on the spot or they ignore it, right? There's very few in between that kind of try it 3 different ways methodically and then document what they've done and then report that. So if you keep your developer abreast of what's going on and they know this app threw 30 errors in the last hour, they could go look at it. They could be more proactive and figure out what's going on. The other thing that Karen said too is no Apex stuff in code. And I agree 100% with that. Unless you need to, right? So this is where it gets a little tricky. Let's say you're using an Apex application and you want to use collections. You need to call the Apex collection APIs in the PL SQL code. There's really no way around that, and you shouldn't try to force your way around that. It will get a little harder to test, but you could basically especially I think starting in 18.1, there's a new command to generate an Apex session inside PL SQL. So if you did need to do something like that, unit test your PL SQL that has Apex specific function calls, you could use one of the new APIs to generate an Apex session from PL SQL to go through, and you could still do your unit testing just fine. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about some things we could do with security and PL SQL and SQL here. This is a simple little app that I use for a presentation called Apex Security Checklist. I'm not going to go through the whole thing here, but I really want to focus on kind of data exposure. This is a critical piece, and I think a lot of people either underuse some of the database capabilities or don't know about it, or try to do things kind of the hard way here. What I've got is a real simple view. This is definitely not my best work here. Select star from NB. And when I run this page, you'll notice that I'm only seeing 5 out of the typical 14 or so records from the EMP table. If we go to Object Browser, just to prove that there are rows here, and I take a look at EMP, right? There's our full set of the rows. But what I'm using here is a view. And the view, when I run it here, we'll probably even get a different set. No, this view is going to bring back the same set no matter what. Let's take a look at how I created that view. And what you'll see here is I've created what's called a system context. Think of this as a database side memory variable that you can very easily and very quickly create and then set through your Apex application or through PL SQL. This where clause is going to pull back the value of syscontext. And I've identified this one as a secure view context, and I've identified the variable name as gdepno, and automatically apply that when I run this view. So another really big benefit and thing that I always kind of advocate with Apex is put all your reports based on views. When you do that, you now have the capability to have a script over here, right? I wouldn't use this. I would actually have it scripted out in version and all that. But I could change the security of a view. I could change the join of a view. I could change how I compute columns within a view and never have to worry about anything inside my Apex application. This has really saved me tons and tons of time. For example, one of the projects I'm working on now is polishing up our tool called Viscosity AMP. All of our security is done through views. So when you see a screen, you're going to see only rows of the applications you have access to. Views are what handle all that. So as I'm tweaking the security and making sure it's working, I don't have to go to 7 or 8 different places in Apex and make sure that I've updated each report. I do it once in a view and it flows through, and then everything is instantly updated. I'm just going to move my screen down just a little bit because the Zoom panel is interfering here. So if we go back and take a look at this procedure, whoops, I said procedure. This is how we're actually generating that secure view context. We're basically just grabbing the department number from the username, and then I'm setting the context here. That's basically passing it in, excuse me, to a specific namespace and the attribute, and then the value of the context. One other thing we need to do in order to get this to work in Apex is if we go into the security attributes, I'm only doing this on one page, but this would be something you would need on your initialization PL SQL code. Now, a couple pieces about these two little regions here that you may or may not be aware of. These two boxes represent the absolute first and absolute last place during an Apex page render that we can influence what happens on the page. This happens after some other critical stuff, such as, is the page running in a valid session? Setting all the globalization attributes, setting the results of authorization schemes. This will then execute, allowing us to do things like set that context for the user, so they can go through and have that view work. Ideally, and I apologize for not putting one here, we should have a cleanup to make sure that that context also gets cleared out. Now, unfortunately, because of Apex's architecture, these have to be here. If you try to put them anywhere else and try to be smarter, you will fail when it comes to anything asynchronous. You will fail when it comes to maintainability and perhaps even performance. So it's a necessary evil. They have to run here. They have to run every page view. That's just the way it is because of how Apex works. If that's not a good solution for you and you want to take advantage of something a little bit more robust, virtual private database is still, I think, one of my favorite database features. Using VPD, I could simply turn the role on, and now I'm only seeing, again, Department 20 records, or I could disable it, and now I see all the records. Now, obviously, you probably wouldn't have these buttons in your app. I would imagine that this would automatically happen, and you only have to set it once. I just did this for demo purposes. VPD also has something called column relevance. So if I wanted to just enable it when a sensitive value was in play, for instance, the salary, watch what happens now. The query on the left doesn't have salary, so it's totally unimpacted at all with my VPD rules. But the query on the right does have salary, so it does filter these records to those that are in my department. So it can be smart, and you can put a little bit of logic behind it using some of the built-in features of VPD. Similarly, redaction. If I jump over here, let me disable the redaction. Oh, looks like it is disabled already. VPD is on. That's why we're only seeing 5 rows. All these security features work with each other, right? So I'm not doing it for a specific page. I'm doing it for the entire record set. Now we're seeing all the records because I've disabled VPD. What redaction does is basically obfuscate or redact a specific column. In this case, we're redacting the salary. If I disable it, we'll see the salary. If I enable it, we won't see the salary. One thing to keep in mind with redaction is it doesn't do anything but strip off the value from the select part of the query. So if I was a smart user here and I wanted to do something like this, let's enable redaction. And then what I want to do is put a filter that says, show me anybody who has a salary that's greater than, say, $2,000. There we go. It's still going to work. I can't see their salary, but I know for sure that these users here, these people are paid over $2,000. And of course, I could get really smart and I could do a between clause and I could really narrow down exactly who makes how much. So if you're going to redact values with Apex, you want to make sure to turn off filtering for the specific columns that you're redacting. Otherwise, it's possible for people with a little bit of time and a little bit of curiosity to kind of narrow down. And again, does it matter that someone makes over $500,000, for instance? No, you just know they make a lot more than you do, yet they do a lot less work than you do, which creates an HR problem, which can create all kinds of problems. One other thing, I know we're running out of time here, and I want to leave some time for questions. Something that Scott showed that I want to highlight. Perfect case I've seen hundreds of times in Apex. The user wants the job title to be below king, right? So if I go into this report, as someone who might not be too familiar with Apex and a little familiar with HTML, I can do something like this, right? I'm going to go ahead and put that BR in between the two. It's pretty small. It's not anything fancy. There's no class override. There's no other way to do this other than that. But here's what I get. I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm going to go through and take a look at my column attributes for ename. And as I start scrolling down, I don't see anything here. You know, that's all the interactive report stuff. Eventually I get down here and say, let me just try that. I want to turn off escaping, and voila, right? We now have our perfect report, exactly the way the users want it, and all is good. Well, here's the problem with that is I'm just going to go to a different form here and edit this record. And this is a pretty innocent hack, right? We'll save that. And you can see here, this report, it safely escaped. My attack was useless, right? Because we're escaping this value. But when I come back to my cross-site scripting report, the first thing we see is the letter X and an alert. Now, this is innocent and it doesn't hurt anybody and it just pops up a value. The real problem here is when this is a harmful attack. One, you won't see it, right? Very few hackers are going to let you know they're taking your data. And two, in this session, I've done a demo where I've got scripts that I've written that can pull all the values of this interactive report and just push them over to a web service. That will persist and continue to work for every user who logs in. So as multiple users log in with different security credentials, anything they see in this report gets pushed over to my web service instantly. And once it's there, it's not coming out, right? That's on a completely different server, perhaps a free server somewhere, you know, even in the Oracle Cloud, it really doesn't matter. And I got the data and I can do what I want with it. So Scott's absolutely right. The way to do this is not like this, but rather going into the ename, let's first of all turn on escape. And then we could just use the column name references here. So pound ename. We can safely put any HTML we want here. And anything in the pound brackets will be escaped. This will not, which is fine. And that's perfectly safe to do it that way. And now when we go in and I hit go, there's my attack successfully neutered and not running anymore.
Nice.
So I think that's about it. I know we're running out of time here. I had a couple other things, but let's address any of the questions that may have popped up in the forum here.
I don't think we have any real active questions that you need to address. There's
Okay.
been an ongoing conversation about the use of views as an abstraction layer. And I just reinforce that one of the main reasons you want to do that, the selecting from views, always using views instead of the base tables, is that say you come out of this session saying sys context, oh my God, those look amazing. I think I could use those. Well, if you didn't use views, if you didn't have that layer of indirection or abstraction between your underlying data sets and your app, you have to go to every single place where you do a query against those tables and add sys context. If you put the view in place, you change the view in one place, your app doesn't change. So that's one question that came up.
So I ran into a similar problem where as part of this product that I'm building, every view needs to join to a security view. That's how I figure out which apps you have access to. Now, this is just kind of a PL SQL or database 101 thing, but that view that I used to figure out what you had access to was being computed in real time. And as things got more complicated, right, and now let's say you had access to 100 apps and each app could have up to 20 roles, you're now making a mess, right? And I took a look at it and I'm like, why am I computing in real time your security access when I could do it once? And if it changes, you log out and you log back in. Or if I had to, I could build a button that says recompute my access. And performance went from bad to fantastic.
Fantastic.
And the beauty there is because it was a view, all I did was create an Apex collection, right? So when you log in, it populates this collection with however many rows. And I just changed my view to point to the collection. So once I realized my mistake, because I was doing the same thing over and over and over again and getting the same results, it literally took 2 minutes to change because I had instrumented every region with views. So the benefits are huge. It's just as important as putting your PL SQL in packages. Your queries should be in views. Even select star from emp might change over time.
All right.
You know, a little more work, but a lot more benefit if and when, more likely when it does change.
Excellent. All right, so we are just coming up on the hour, and I'd love to respect everyone's time, especially our presenters. So what I'm going to do is switch over to my screen, and let's bring on our other speakers. In fact, I'm going to stop sharing entirely and bring on the rest of our speakers. We'll turn your video on if you don't mind, and let's take questions. See what anything that came up in the chat or any other questions you've got now, or even conversation among the speakers themselves. There was some more conversation about if you use a view, for example, can you still build a form on the view, or do you lose that capability? And it's, as a number of people have made clear, you can still create a form that works against a view. It needs to be an updatable view or instead of triggers, but there's no reason not to. So questions and comments. Any other tips you have about using PL SQL in Apex?
We never talked about the V function.
Oh, right.
So
Go
the
for
V
it.
function, that's going to return the current value of an Apex item in a specific session state. Will I use it? Sure. But typically, what I might do is embed that in a view that I want to have compute that V function as part of, say, the predicate in the view. Keep in mind, it's better to do not just where item equals V function. It's a little more performant to do item equals select V function from dual. That way it runs it once and it uses that throughout. So if you've got 100 rows, you're not doing it 100 times. Inside your code, it's a bad idea because that Apex specificizes, if that's a word, your code, and now that code can only be run from an Apex procedure. I would prefer to pass those items in. I've done way back when I did, analysis on how much faster it is to pass in parameters versus the V function. It's a small number, but as that iteration adds up, the number gets bigger, of course.
All right. Scott, Scott Wesley, any last comments from you?
No, I think we covered things pretty well in the hour that we had, and I look forward to doing this again.
Great. Thank you so much, and thanks for that app, and we'll get the link out to it. And Karen, don't see you on screen, but any last comments? Final words of wisdom? Okay, so thank you everybody for joining. Hopefully you had a great time, learned a lot from our wonderful experts. I hope you have a great holiday season. And next month in January, we're going to again rely on external experts because basically I don't have to do any work. I kind of like that, but we're going to go back to testing and we're going to take a look at specifically the challenge of doing database setup and teardown in the context of automated testing, which is often one of the major obstacles. So you have that to look forward to, and it certainly integrates into concepts around testing Apex apps as well. Again, thanks for joining us, and happy holidays and happy PL SQL coding. Happy Apex coding. Take care, everybody.
Yes.
Right. Happy holidays.